Dr. TJ student, so please introduce.
Okay. So, this is the fourth talk that I forced my students to give concerning their research results, because this is such a great forum for students to get practice. But I'd like to introduce Kathleen Madden. Kathleen is also a senior biology major. Currently, she's doing undergraduate work with me on a different topic. But she found a really unique perspective, a different kind of topic that most of us don't think of. And again, her research was taking our current knowledge based on finding all the literature available on a topic and evaluating what's been done. So I'm going to let Kathleen take it away. But another study from Freshwater Biology.
So my study is on the global scale effects of pollution on parasites and freshwater health. And with the growing increase of human activity on freshwater environments, it poses a serious threat, but there is very little information that explores the simultaneous effects between parasites and their hosts in the presence of pollutants. And the purpose of this review is to explore the effects of pollution on the health of freshwater fish and their parasites on a global scale. So in doing so, it would provide some insights of the state of fish health and their parasites in relation to habitat changes, things like introduction of heavy metals, changes in abiotic factors, and also an increase of pollutants. So it's important because it really does underline the vulnerability of freshwater fish induced stressors of these pollutants, and it leads to things like weakened immune responses, as well as increased susceptibility to parasitic infection, and also altered host parasitic dynamics. So my methods and analysis, I use things like Google Scholar as well as Science Direct, and I use key words like parasitism, pollution, freshwater fish, and health effects. And these papers that were collected, there were about 30 of them, and I had to compile them and group them based on things like years published, the location of the study, and also study design, which include survey, empirical or experimental, and any laboratory studies. And they're also grouped on pollution type, since there are obviously a lot of different kinds of pollutants. So some of the kinds were heavy metals, microplastics. Chemicals included things like PVA and PCB, and there are also other kinds of pollutants, like for example industrial and agricultural pollution, as well as sewage effluent. And these other factors that were considered were the fish health measurements. So this would be immune response, physiological and tissue damage, and condition factors include the overall health of the fish. So this would include things like growth rate and feeding rate, as well as other kinds of information regarding their health. And for the outcomes, some of the studies, it depended whether they had a positive effect on the fish's health, or negative, neutral, or even both. Because at lower doses, they were heavily affected in a negative way, but in higher doses, the doses actually, they did better because in the presence of parasitic infection. And as for the results, just to make it easier, these were the figures that were made based on all the information compiled from the Excel. And also, based on all of this, a lot of these studies were relatively recent. The oldest I found were in 1998, and there were even studies that I found were that just came out this year or last year. And a lot of the studies occurred in rivers, and some of them were lakes, and they're also mainly concentrated in African regions, not so many in other regions of the world, but a few of them were scattered. And also the parasites, they ranged from trematodes, nematodes, and flatworms, and more. And I grouped them based on what kind of parasite they were. And these are the pie graphs that were made. So as you can see, a majority of the studies were based on heavy metals, and also a lot of them were survey-based. There's very few that were centered around laboratory studies. And as you can see as well, there is like a huge majority of studies that found that they have like negative effects on fish health. And also you can see their response variables, a huge amount of them had like physiological or tissue damage. So it's pretty clear from all this information that there's a strong negative link between pollution and parasitism on fish health. And I was only able to find 30 papers because there are some knowledge gaps, because a large majority of these studies mainly study the effects of pollution on like fish by itself, but there isn't any lot of papers that actually try to study the simultaneous effects, because the presence of infection of parasitism is really important because it does have like an effect to it. So some of the knowledge gaps, so there are like relationships between pollution type and fish health, and like are there like different kinds of groups of species, and also there are some studies that are mostly based on biomonitoring, where they try to go into the fish and then they were able to find the presence of like metal concentrations, and what are the outcomes based on parasitism. And also a few of these studies actually found that the parasites mediated the effects of metal pollution as the parasites absorbed the metals, which actually lowered the threshold of toxicity, so it actually helped the parasites or helped the host in a very positive way. So is this like a common phenomenon? Like, can parasites absorb like other type of toxins? I found that it was only with like heavy metals. And just some like other directions of that were not included in my survey. What is like the relationship between parasite diversity and fish biodiversity in like these freshwater systems? And like an overall inventory of like the types of fish parasites that exist in these systems. And I think it's really important to try to do other types of studies, because as you can see, a large majority of them were just survey-based. There were very few that were based in a laboratory. Like they never tried to actually have a controlled environment where they introduced parasitism and also like other kinds of pollutants.
Okay, are there questions for our speaker?
Yes.
So I'm not sure I can formulate this question. I'm going to try. So I was just thinking that, one, I'm curious if this kind of study manages, if you know, from your reading, did you get the impression that these types of studies inform industries or government about how much pollution is allowed? Or is this something that's sort of like, you know, glossed over and not really on their radar in terms of making decisions about how many pollutants can get into the environment? Because I'm imagining the government sort of set a bar for what's allowed, and you know, it's a sort of measuring aspect of that.
I found that at the very least, these studies does raise awareness of the importance of like trying to at least manage the amount of pollutants that's in like these freshwater systems. Especially because a lot of these studies were like a lot of them I found them in Egypt, and they were trying to study like a few rivers, including the Nile River, and I believe it's been heavily polluted because of human activity. So at the very least, these studies do like at least tell us like, oh, the fish and ecosystem are heavily affected, and also like parasites are also involved, because with the introduction of these pollutants, a lot of the times it made them more susceptible to like parasitic infection, which is really bad.
Other questions? All right, let's thank our speaker again.